Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable, and the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why the Australian Institute is publishing our first book as part of our 30th anniversary celebrations. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia from leading thinkers such as Yanis Varoufakis, Auntie Pat Anderson, and Professor Peter Doherty. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to pre-order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Welcome to After America. I'm Dr Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. After a cheeky week off to try and reset, we are back to look at the implications of a second Trump administration for the United States and for the rest of the world. And Trump hasn't wasted any time in giving us a preview. He's been very busy selecting his nominees for cabinet, reminding us just how chaotic things are in Trump world. He's tapped Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to run what they're calling the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, which isn't an actual department, but is a reminder of both how embarrassing and how powerful Elon Musk is. Musk has been joining Trump's calls and even doing meetings on his own. He met with the Iranian ambassador a week after the election. Meanwhile, Trump's pick for Attorney General, Matt Gaetz, a pick John Bolton described as the worst in American history, lasted only 8 days, so less than a Scaramucci.
Well, it must be the worst nomination for a cabinet position in American history. Gaetz is not only totally incompetent for this job, he doesn't have the character. He is a person of moral turpitude.
You're saying he's the worst. That's a pretty strong language. The worst ever.
Bolton later reassessed, claiming that it was Sebastian Gorka, who Trump has tapped to be Senior Director for Counterterrorism, who's the worst pick in recent American history.
Well, Sebastian Gorka is a con man. I wouldn't have him in any U.S. government. Fortunately, it's not the highest position he had been mentioned for, but I don't think it's going to bode well for counterterrorism efforts when the NSC's senior director is somebody like that.
We are quickly running out of new things to say. Trump's other picks, if they stick around, will cause more harm and more chaos. It's an early reminder for the rest of the world that this isn't just about managing or dealing with Trump himself, but also who he listens to. Musk, his hawkish defence pick, Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, Dr. Oz, and how their ideologies and their egos clash, especially when Trump inevitably gets distracted while they get on with implementing their own, often conflicting agendas. What they do, even if their work isn't obviously internationally focused, will have big implications for the rest of us. So it's critical to understand, for example, what RFK Jr. might actually do if he does end up running the Department of Health and Human Services, and what that will mean for the rest of the world. To discuss just that, we are joined this week by my truly extraordinary friend, Dr. Ruth Mitchell. Ruth is a board member of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, making her a founding member of the team that received Australia's first ever Nobel Peace Prize, which ICAN won in 2017. She's also a neurosurgeon at the Sydney Children's Hospital and the Prince of Wales Hospital, and the chair of the board of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the first woman to hold that role. She also chairs the board of the Ubuntu Lab, an emerging museum of the humanities. I was not exaggerating when I said that Ruth is extraordinary. Here she is now. Ruth, thank you so much for joining us on After America. It's so lovely to have you.
It's great to be here. What fun.
Hopefully. Hopefully fun and not too depressing. I wanted to start by asking you, Ruth, because you are an actual brain surgeon. How worried should we be that Donald Trump is going to nominate Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a man who has had actual, literal brainworms, to run the US Department of Health and Human Services?
Look, I mean, I'm not thrilled. I'm going to be honest. And, despite what people might think, the fact that, and I mean, I haven't seen his scans, but from what we can tell, it sounds like he's had neurocysticercosis. It's the most common, brain worm that people get from food. So wash your hands, kids. But I would say that it's actually not the neurocysticercosis or whatever the brain worm is that worries me the most about RFK Jr. as a potential leader in the health space. It's kind of what he's been doing with his brain more than what's in it.
President-elect Donald Trump has followed through with a campaign promise to pick Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to lead the Department of Health and Human Services and to let him go wild.
He's going to help make America healthy again.
Kennedy has made several disproven claims, like linking vaccines to autism, and he's vowed to remove fluoride from drinking water.
There are worries, too, about his history of false statements and beliefs in debunked conspiracy theories on subjects like HIV and AIDS, antidepressants, and autism.
And now he's a great guy, and he really means it. He wants to do some things, and we're going to let him go to it.
And the kind of policies and the statements he's made, the people he whips up into a frenzy, are generally not the kinds of positions, policies, people that we find are helpful for, good health at a global scale. And of course, what happens in Washington and the United States matters to everyone, sets the tone for the world in ways that goodness knows I wish wasn't the case. But certainly when it comes to health and when it comes to attitudes and ideas and understandings about science and about what we understand about COVID, about vaccines, about autism, about fluoride, all of these things, it's pretty concerning right now. So I would say that I would prefer it if we had more of a commitment to science going forward than what we've seen from him in the past. And there's no evidence to suggest that he'll demur, but we can remain hopeful that he will actually listen to scientists on things he hasn't in the past. Well, we know that actual harm has happened because of his position on vaccines, including the deaths of many people, including children in Samoa, because of the anti-vax sentiment and the suspicion around vaccines that he has incited. So he's already shown himself to be a person with incredible amounts of power and persuasive capability. And I wish he'd used that brain for good.
I think you're not alone there. And I think it's so important that you highlight the global consequences of these appointments and the kinds of people who will be running these departments, because there's a tendency, I'm sure you've encountered this as well, to isolate that kind of analysis to specific foreign policy portfolios as opposed to something like health, which is, of course, more domestically focused. I'm wondering if you could take us into a bit more the potential, at least global consequences of these kinds of appointments. So you mentioned Samoa, for example, which is a critical example, I think, of people to be aware of real world consequences. But there's also that kind of political feedback loop that you highlighted as well, in that, I saw on Blue Sky, where everyone is, just yesterday, that RFK Jr. and Pete Evans, who is a similar kind of figure here in Australia, are teaming up. So what do you think are the consequences of that? And probably more importantly, what are the kinds of things that, we can do, those of us who pay attention, to try and mitigate some of the damage that might cause?
So I think we have to be we can't take anything for granted, We take it for granted that people know that you should wash your hands. And one of Trump's other, prospective appointees has said he hasn't washed his hands for 10 years. Microdosing E. coli ain't it, kids. This is not a good move. We can't take it for granted that people are invested in or believe in the germ theory of disease, that people think microbes are real just because they can't see them, So we actually cannot turn our back on basic public health education, science education, and primary, health promotion messaging at any stage. We kind of get complacent about the basics that make our lives together work. And certainly, we've had a round of discourse around that, several rounds of discourse around that with the COVID-19 pandemic and the vaccines for that, and the amount of distrust that people have. And we have to be able to create spaces where people can have a conversation about maybe they have concerns about an ingredient in a vaccine without saying, that it hasn't been looked into. It's absolutely been looked into. Millions of people have had these vaccines completely safely. And so we have to stand up for facts and truth. And we also need to make sure that scientists are supported to have a voice and that they're trained to speak to the public. I mean, one of the challenges we have is that often scientific information is hidden behind paywalls. And it's hard for people to find out what's in there and what it says and to access it in a digestible format. Meanwhile, for free and without even looking for it, you can find out what Pete Evans thinks or any number of other influencers whose perspectives are based not on fact, but on fantasy, and not sort of like whimsical fantasy, but super dangerous misinformation fantasy. And so it's really troubling when you see sort of who RFK Jr. is mates with, because it gives you a sense of what's to come. And so I think we all have a role in addressing and speaking up when we see misinformation and addressing it and letting people know why we were concerned about it. I mean, I'm joining you from my office where I often meet with patients and their families, and quite a lot of my work is undoing what people have read on the internet about their condition and, the things that people have Googled. And so, but we need to be doing that in all of our interactions across the board.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important point. And your point about communication is particularly critical, given that Trump and the people around him are so effective at communication, regardless of whether we like what they're saying, we can acknowledge that they're really good at it. And you mentioned, Trump and his mates in particular. And I think, I guess to kind of shift a little bit in our look at global consequences, one of the things they've been really good at communicating is that Trump is anti-war. One of the things that you're very focused on, of course, is peace building. And so I wonder what your take is on that kind of storytelling, because I'm pretty firmly of the belief that Trump is not anti-war at all, not even remotely, but I can see why that line is very appealing to Americans.
Look, I think this is a critical thing that we have to grapple with. I mean, first and foremost, we know that Trump is unpredictable. And so it's difficult to say what things will look like over the next 4 years, except that we do have some precedents from the first Trump administration. And when it comes to war and his attitudes towards international relations, what we do know is that he's been no friend of a treaty. And so has a solid track record of wrecking treaties, of withdrawing from treaties, of getting in the way of treaties, of downplaying treaties, of throwing them in the trash, of saying he'll get rid of them and try something else. I mean, I don't know. Like, this is not someone who really does master the art of the deal in the international relations space. So his idea that he could replace any treaty with something he and his people have negotiated, it doesn't inspire me with confidence. I can see how people think that because Trump is a little bit, maybe like there are some isolationist tendencies that he has, that maybe he wants to withdraw from the kind of overactive imperialist participation in world affairs that we've certainly seen with the current U.S. administration, with dire consequences on multiple fronts. But I think that his narcissism will win out. And I think that more than anything, his first administration was characterized by a foreign policy of narcissism. And so, a very personality-driven approach. And so having everything be bigger and better and the best will also inform the size of nuclear arsenal, the desire for modernization, the desire to be in theaters of war that don't exist yet. So I think that we should expect a sort of expansionism, maybe not coming from an imperialism, but coming from a narcissism. That's what I guess I'm bracing for. And I think that the larger point is that the existence of a world leader, and I use the word loosely, leader, like Donald Trump, really calls the lie to the idea that there's any good hands for nuclear weapons in particular. And so it's really obvious when you have Trump as a person with a nuclear football with the suitcase and the codes, that's a terrible idea. Like, it's super obvious. But actually, they're not really good in anyone's hands. It's just more obvious when it's Trump. And so we have to be clear about that. It's not like everything suddenly got more dangerous. Things have been pretty dire all along. And the only reason we haven't all been blown to smithereens and aren't currently in a nuclear winter is literally luck. That's all that's holding us, back from the brink. And so we have to be realistic and honest about the fact that our approaches to making the world a safer, better place, particularly when it comes to arms reduction and nuclear abolition, are bigger than this problem. They're bigger than the problem of the incoming administration. They span the political spectrum, and it doesn't really matter who's in charge. As long as they're nuclear weapons, we're at risk.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important to highlight again, that Trump is a symptom and not a cause, across multiple fronts. And, I think you're absolutely right to point out his narcissism, and that's where my assessment of him, not being anti-war comes from. He loves the idea of bigger bombs. He loves talking about how big his big red button is and that it works better than anybody else.
But if I were the president, I would inform the threatening country, in this case Iran, that if you do anything to harm this person, we are going to blow your largest cities and the country itself to smithereens. We're going to blow it to smithereens. You can't do that.
Mr. Trump tweets, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un just stated that the nuclear button is on his desk at all times. Will someone from his depleted and food-starved regime please inform him that I too have a nuclear button, but it is a much bigger and more powerful one than his, and my button works.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. They asked me that question. One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want.
I think, though, that perhaps the more concerning thing this time around is that the people alongside him and beneath him are much more organised. And there's a big push in Project 2025, for example, the Heritage Foundation's project, to, as you say, modernise and dramatically increase the United States nuclear arsenal. And, alongside the kind of that Trumpian narcissism, that's pretty worrying. But of course, that doesn't mean that everybody else is powerless to do anything about it. So I guess where to from here for nuclear non-proliferation and particularly the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which of course the United States hasn't signed and Trump is not going to sign. Where do you think that goes from here?
Well, I think that it's never been more obvious that, the nations of the world need to declare their independence from this sort of hegemonic American way of doing things. I think particularly in Australia, we've chained ourselves to the US and to US foreign policy, and we've sort of adopted it as our own in many ways. And we haven't declared our independence in any meaningful way. And the shortcomings of that are becoming much more evident in this new era. And so I think, you mentioned the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Of course, when that was negotiated, that was during the first Trump administration. He said that not only would he wasn't going to sign it, but the US was never going to sign it. And look, that's certainly something that's possible. But in the meantime, the majority of the world's people want to get rid of nuclear weapons. And we're working towards near to a majority of the world's nations having signed the treaty. So it's not a position that should govern us. And so what we see around the world is a movement to stigmatize nuclear weapons and increasing awareness of the danger that they pose if they were used, but also the costs of having them, the risks of having them, and the price that has been paid by people wherever they've been tested. So not only the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, whose suffering and survivorship we will commemorate the 80th year of next year, but also the victims and survivors of nuclear testing around the world. And that burden has been borne disproportionately by Indigenous people. And I think we need to acknowledge that. And the way that we can honor those people and also move our conversation forward towards a human security, a feminist security way of looking at things is actually to center those voices. And I mean, this is partly why I'm so glad for the recent announcement of the Nobel Peace Prize for this year to the largest group of hibakusha, or survivors of the nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And by listening to the stories of survivors of nuclear weapons and by centering the voices of humans who have been the victims and the survivors of these terrible weapons, wherever they've been used or tested, we're able to understand the actual cost, the human cost of weapons, and frame a way forward that's about humanity. So what does that look like in practical terms? Because people think, well, I can't do anything. I'm not running a country. I don't have any nuclear weapons to get rid of. The thing is, we all have, some influence and some way of using a voice. And the other thing we all have is, maybe it's just debt, but something to do with money. Something to do with money, either investments or debt or dealings with financial institutions. And so there's something that everyone can do in terms of making sure that their financial institutions, their super, their whatever, isn't invested in nuclear weapons. That's something every single one of us can do. So one of the collaborations between ICANN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and the Medical Association for the Prevention of War has been something called Quit Nukes. So you can look up and check out the report card and find out, hang on a minute, is my super doing dirty business? Is my money fueling this war machine? We all have something we can do. And around the world, we're seeing this increasing stigmatization of particularly nuclear weapons. So when the governments of the world are unwilling to move, then we can use other ways of shifting the dial of human history. And so I think things like boycotts and sanctions, these all have a role in these spaces, but divestment is a really big thing that everyone needs to consider. I think it fits into also the larger picture of wanting to declare our own independence from a warlike mentality. So obviously the implications are very profound for Australia and for Australian foreign policy and for domestic conversations. And certainly something, I've been calling for, and we've been calling for a very long time, is for the current government to, get off the pot and sign and ratify the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And I think that would be a statement that would say, we're not with Trump. We're not with Trump on this. And so if we don't do that, then it raises serious questions about where our allegiances really are.
It does, and I suspect there will be significant pressure on the Australian government going forward as that pressure increases, not just on nuclear weapons, but on Israel as well, depending on what Trump does. So I'm interested in particular, given ICANN's role here in Australia, being the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize and the driver of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, demonstrating that Australia actually can have a pretty significant influence on the world. What do you think, or how, I suppose, do you think, given what you've just said, Australia can respond, not just to Trump, but to these broader issues that you've highlighted?
Well, I think we need to expect more of our politicians. Like, we need to ask more of our leaders. We need to demand that the decisions that are made in Canberra reflect the needs and ambitions and desires of people who live here in Australia. And that needs to be something that's done in a way that honors the fact that this is unceded sovereign Indigenous land and that we have an unpaid debt to, I think of myself as an uninvited settler in this land, and we have to pay the rent. And that takes many formats. But one of them is to honor the legacy, for example, of the survivors of British Army nuclear testing in the South Australian desert, in the islands around Australia. We also need to be good neighbors. And so participating as good neighbors in our Pacific region means we have to take a perspective that is centered on an acknowledgement of the environment and this feeds into everything, the climate crisis. We need to heed the calls of our Pacific neighbors who are asking us to put our money where our mouth is when it comes to climate finance, but also to stop opening like coal mines and things like this. Like, this makes no sense. Like, the math isn't mathing. It's such arrogance to think that the rules don't apply to us, that we can somehow do something different with some Excel spreadsheet about carbon and get our way out of the fact that, we're spewing like toxins into the stratosphere. Like, this is, I think we're really arrogant. And I think what's coming is we're going to be humbled. And I'm worried that what that's going to look like is we're going to end up, we're going to get the politicians we deserve. And so I think we should earn better. We should earn better representatives. We should find the best people we can to lead us. And we should listen to the people who are already leading from, I guess, the trenches, from the ground, and be informed by what's happening to everyday people. There's a terrible disconnect between what happens in Canberra and what really matters to people. And it feels distant and it feels drafty. And I think we're in for some shocks over the next little while. And then everyone's going to go, oh, I just didn't see any of this coming. And it's like, wake up, what happened in the United States, we're not so dramatically different. We can see the undermining of democracy here. We can see the undermining of human rights and civil liberties and of basic things we fought really hard for. We're not far away. So I think we need to be humble and work hard.
I think that's such a lovely sentiment, and certainly gives me hope, and I hope it gives other people hope as well in what feels like not particularly hopeful time in the world at the moment. Ruth, thank you so much for your generosity and your intellect. We're so grateful for your time.
Thank you. It's always wonderful to speak with you, Emma.
This episode was recorded on Thursday, the 21st of November. No doubt a bunch of stuff will have happened since then. You will have heard at the start of this episode that the Australia Institute is publishing our very first book as part of our 30th anniversary celebrations. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia from leading thinkers including Yanis Varoufakis, Auntie Pat Anderson and Professor Peter Doherty. There's also one from me on the future of Australia's relationship with the United States. You can pre-order it now via our website, australiainstitute.org.au. If you're enjoying After America, please help us spread the word by telling your friends about the show. You can find us on social media. We're at the Oz Institute, that's with an AUS, on Twitter and Instagram. And we are at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky. You can reach out to us with feedback and episode ideas via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. We'll be back next Tuesday. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.